Hello and welcome to tonight's CIGI Signature Lecture and the keynote address for the 2012 Japan Futures Initiative Spring Symposium, the inaugural symposium of the Japan Futures Initiative. I'm David Welch, the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs, and it's my pleasure to be your host tonight. To our audience in the room, welcome. Some of you have come from a very, very long way away to be with us today and tomorrow. And to our web audience, welcome as well. Some of you are also a very long way away. The Japan Futures Initiative is a new enterprise based here at the University of Waterloo, but not solely at the University of Waterloo, the purpose of which is to help re-energize the policy-relevant social scientific study of Japan. As those of us who follow trends in international studies have noticed, interest in Japan as a subject of serious social scientific research has declined quite dramatically over the past 10 years or so, primarily as a result of the experience of Japan having been in decline itself from the heady days of the economic bubble in the 1980s and 1990s. And as a result of China's rise and Korea's skillful entrepreneurship in the cultivation of interest in the research about Korea overseas, a lot of resources have been steered towards the study of China and Korea in the last decade and away from Japan. While this might be understandable in a simple psychological sense, it's my view and the view of my colleagues who've been engaged in the process of cultivating the Japan Futures Initiative that this is a serious mistake for a couple of reasons. The first and most important of which is that there is no better or more important time for those of us in OECD countries to be studying Japan, because Japan is at the forefront of all of the challenges that Canada, the United States, most European countries, Australia, New Zealand are all going to be facing very shortly. Declining population, steady state or declining economic growth, aging population, energy shortages. Japan is the country that is going to confront these things first. Japan is a country of great, great resourcefulness, amazing human capital, a great deal of financial capital, notwithstanding the sovereign debt situation, a great deal of ingenuity. Japan has a history of overcoming serious challenge, overcoming serious devastation, not only from World War II, but as we've seen most recently, almost a year ago, from the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami of March 11, 2011. Japan is a country that knows how to deal with challenges, and Japan is dealing with the challenges that we here in Canada and elsewhere will be dealing with very shortly. So this is a particularly good time for us to be paying more, not less, attention to Japan. So the Japan Futures Initiative is a network of scholars and practitioners, open to anyone, anywhere, largely at the moment, because we're new, here in Canada and in Japan. The purpose of which is to help synergize collective study of Japan from a policy-relevant social scientific perspective. And today is the beginning of our first, what we hope will be an annual symposium, to look at various challenges that Japan is facing and to see how we, as a larger community, might learn from them. The topic of this year's symposium is disaster management, energy security, and multilateral cooperation, the Tohoku disaster and its regional and global implications. And that will be the focused study of the symposium all day tomorrow. But to begin us tonight, we have a somewhat more uplifting theme. We're very pleased to welcome as our keynote speaker, Professor John Kirton from the University of Toronto, who's the director of the G8 Research Group and the co-director of the G20 Research Group at the Munk School for Global Affairs, and a prolific author, and I think I'm on safe ground saying recognized worldwide as the world's first authority on the G8, G20, and global governance related to those forms of symmetry. The G8 Research Group, for those who do not know, is the de facto secretariat of the G8. G8 research group tracks the commitments of G8 countries year after year, monitors their compliance to the commitments, and acts as a repository of information about any and all aspects of G8 summitry. And Professor Kirton has been quarterbacking this effort now for many, many years, and knows more about it than any other human alive. John is going to speak tonight to us about Japan's contribution to global governance. And when we advertised this keynote lecture, that was the title I understood that he wanted to use. A little bit later, he came back to me and said, I'd prefer to talk about Japan's leadership in global governance. And I said, by all means, please do that. Leadership is certainly a form of contribution. So please join me in welcoming Professor John Kirton to the podium. And for those of you who are watching via webcast, we will ask you please to think about questions and indicate via the chat function on the webcast. Questions you might have for Professor Kirton. He would be more than happy to answer them when he is given his presentation, and we look forward to that opportunity. John.
Thank you very much, David. Arigatou gozaimasu for those kind words, for your important role in bringing together and inaugurating this important event. But I think more broadly, for those of us of a particular generation who have long been studying Japan, for taking the leadership in the initiative to really unleash a new generation of scholarly thinking on Japan and its role in the world, both in Canada, but with so many distinguished colleagues from Japan itself. Thank you also for the sponsors of this event, and if I single out one on a personal note, I'm sure you'll forgive me, David DeWitt, a career-long colleague. So thank you for your support, David, and for flying back from Washington to identify and correct any errors I may make, as you've been doing as a good colleague for the past several decades, I might reveal. It's a great honor, especially in the company of such distinguished authorities, to launch our look at Japan. Japan during its time of troubles right now, but Japan in a global context and how the two come together at the moment and as we look forward to the future of Japan in the world. I think it's important to start with the time of troubles because at first glance, over the past year and indeed for the 2 decades before, Japan has had a truly tough time, which I know many are all too familiar with, but it's important, I think, to identify specifically the many challenges that seem to confront Japan and its friends at this time. The first, of course, the great disaster of March 13th last year. Not just a natural disaster, we've had those before, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. Not just a nuclear disaster, as those other two were, but it was as if Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island had been combined with the Great Asian Tsunami, and then produced a major economic disaster for Japan as well. So it was a triple disaster all in one time, in one place. And I think that's an unprecedented shock and an unprecedented challenge for global governance as a whole. The shocks, of course, hit Japan, whose GDP had contracted last year, contracted last quarter, and is still even below its peak economic performance before Lehman went down on September 15th of 2008. It also compounded the problem of Japan's soaring fiscal deficit, 7.6% of GDP this year, but within that, What the triple disaster brought was a newly severe structural deficit as the atomic power stations went offline, as supply chains were disrupted, and as massive new monies were required for immediate disaster relief and then for the reconstruction effort that goes on now. Japan's public debt, compounded by this spending, already it's number one in the world at 236% of GDP. And that at a time, of course, when, because of the euro crisis, markets and many others are sensitive to the aggregate debt burdens that a country bears. Not surprisingly, one of the rating agencies in Japan last December downgraded Japan's score, wondering if Japan could continue to service the debt as well as it had for many long years. Japan's export-dependent economy, hurt by a soaring yen, perversely, but behind that lies an undervaluated Chinese yuan next door, tied to a dropping US dollar as well. A big hit for the export-dependent economy that Japan has long had. Japan's trade deficit has just reappeared after an absence of 31 years, largely because of the impact of Fukushima. Before Fukushima, Japan relied on nuclear energy for about 29% of its electricity. It was going to go to 50% by 2030 for all the good reasons. But now with most of the reactors offline, it's had to massively import fossil fuel from abroad. And in fact, its utilities demand for oil imports have increased by a factor of 4 just over the last year, with, of course, implications for energy prices for Americans filling up at the pump and many other people in the world. Japan's population size, we know, is shrinking. Fewer Japanese citizens to bear the financial burden. Its population is aging very quickly, already number one in the OECD, but quite predictably, as the population ages, they turn from that phenomenal savings rate, 16%, which Japan produced about 20 years ago, which would finance within Japan those great government deficits and debt. It's now dropped to about 2%, forcing Japan, looking forward, depend on international markets to cover the deficits and debt. Politically, of course, we've had revolving door prime ministers. Average tenure in office about 1 year, no more. Very different days from those of Nakasone-san and Koizumi-san, and one wonders when it will end, or even if there's more to come. Perhaps both of the old line parties, many fear, will soon be blown away by a new regionally based party out of Osaka with new but still untested ideas on a national scale. Last year, of course, China surpassed Japan as the number 2 most powerful country in the world by the conventional measures. And Japan's Asian neighbors continue to produce very real political and security threats. China, yes, but of course, a already nuclear-armed North Korea, too. So that, I think, is the big tale of woe, and it is a very tall tale. But let me suggest that it's not the whole story of Japan's position, power, and place in the world. And let me argue more provocatively that it's not even the most important part of the story about today's Japan. Because I think if one looks at the record, one will see that Amidst all of these unprecedented challenges, Japan's involvement, Japan's influence in global governance have grown, and grown into the realm where we can move from just a contribution, but speak with hard evidence of Japan's leadership in global governance in our 21st century world. What I think we see is that Japan's influence is meeting this high standard in what many acknowledge as probably the two centers of global governance in the modern world. The somewhat old but still continuing group of 8 in charge of security and development, and the new group of 20 allocated the task of financial and economic governance, a newer group created at the level of finance ministers and central bank governors in 1999, but of course one that leapt to the leaders' level soon after Lehman Brothers went down in the autumn of 2008. If you look at actually what Japan's position is, what its performance has been in those two centers of global governance, yes, you will see that sometimes Japan acts as a loyal American ally. Many other members of those groups too. Sometimes Japan is a mediating bridge builder, often between Asia and America or the Atlantic, but other countries play that role in the G20 above all. But beyond that, the primary pattern, I think, is a Japan that actually leads the G8 and the G20 in producing the global governance that Japan prefers and that many of its closest partners, including Canada, do as well. We start, of course, by playing defense, as is often the case in international politics. What we can see is that the G8 and the G20 has given Japan enhanced access to its great American ally. FaceTime with the president, an important asset for pretty much every country in the world. Japan has also been able to secure exemptions for its exceptional needs, and has been also able to join with others to veto bad ideas, even when they're backed by Team Europe with the support of the United States. But beyond that, offensively, and here's where we move from contribution defensively to offensive leadership in shaping the global governance of today, Japan has been an Asian advocate. It's not just there for itself, but for all of a rising Asia. It's been there as a leader in reforming the old multilateral institutions, above all the International Monetary Fund, designed in 1944, in order to give the rapidly rising emerging powers, above all in Asia, the voice, the vote, as it's known, that their resources now show that they richly deserve. Japan has also been there to provide global public goods, providing money, more than its fair share, to help the world get through the great challenges, above all the greatest recession since the Great Depression of the 30s that we saw in 2008 and 2009. And also, I think, slowly, often quietly, but cumulatively, shaping a new world order more in the image of Japan and, of course, on behalf of the values that Japan has pioneered at home and that the rest of the world increasingly understand it needs everywhere. This basic view of Japan's performance in the G8 and G20, I must say at the start, is not the prevailing portrait that most of my colleagues who look at these things would offer to you. In a conventional view, Japan faces, as do other countries and the global community, a truly painful choice. A painful choice that's usually framed between an old, dying 20th century G8 and a new, rising 21st century G20. And Japan, poor Japan, it is said, has made the wrong choice to hang in there with the old, declining 20th century G8 at the expense of embracing and leading the new 21st century G20. The evidence shows me that is simply incorrect. There is no choice, or there is a choice. What Japan in practice has done, as have several other smart countries, they have chosen both the G8 and the G20 too. And in the case of Japan, we can see its leadership in both of the G8 and the G20 groups. Start with the G8, because it's been around a long time. And if you think of the G8 versus the G20, if there's a choice to be made, you can understand why people think that Japan would prefer the G8, as in fact, Japan is probably the most loyal country to that proven group. Canada, maybe Russia come a close second, but Japan clearly here is number one. When the proto-G8 started, the first summit back in the summer of 1975, it was a group of only 4 leaders meeting in the British Embassy in Helsinki on the margins of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And that tells much about where the center of global governance, at least geographically, was back then, and indeed continuously since the world of 1944-45. Japan just wasn't there. But a few months later, when the first real G7 summit was held at Rambouillet, France, November 1975, Japan was a full equal member from the first moment, a status it didn't have then in the United Nations Security Council, a status it doesn't have to this day in that center of UN governance. So you compare the two global institutions that do global peace and security, you could see why Japan would like to be acknowledged as of 1975 and now as one of the leading powers of the world to contribute to global security governance in its own particular way. At that first summit at Rambouillet, Japan was, of course, the only Asian representative. If you go to the United Nations Security Council, of course, China has that slot. It was Japan that suggested that this new center of global governance actually tell the world transparency, what its core purpose was, what all of the members were committed to. And thus, because of Japan, we got, at the opening of the communique of that first summit, the charter equivalent for an informal institution, a declaration that these countries had not rights, but responsibilities, and responsibilities to protect within themselves, but to promote globally the specific values of open democracy, individual liberty, and social advance. And although this wasn't said to do so, if necessary, by intervening in the internal affairs of sovereign states to get that democratization job done. So if you think that democratization is more of a prevailing reality in the global community now than one. You can say that the G8 has been on the right side of history, and Japan, of course, at the core of the attempt to do what we might call right rule. We can look over the long 37 plus years of G8 summitry, in the first instance, at the summits Japan actually hosted, to see the difference Japan made, because in G8 summitry, as in other summitries, the host has an increasing ability to shape the agenda, to nudge the outcomes towards the agreements that it prefers. The first summit Japan hosted was in 1979 in Tokyo. You can take your mind back to the world of 1979. Iran was a very big problem. Gas prices at the pumps in the United States were soaring. Some of the same problems we're confronting right now. But at the 1979 summit, Japan got its G7 countries to stop the second oil shock. The first had been in 1973. And not just to beat that clear and present danger of the moment, but to stop the world from being afflicted by oil shocks of similar scale and scope and severity ever since. So what we are seeing at the moment is but a mere miniature reflect. Moreover, and as part of that, the 1979 summit invented for the world the global governance for control of climate change. And it did so by putting in place the most ambitious control regime and the most effective control regime that the world has seen ever since. So if climate change matters as an integral part of energy security, and if you need to govern both together, that was done with enormous ambition and effectiveness at the first summit Japan hosted in 1979. At that summit, Japan showed its instinct to be more inclusive, to bring more Asians into that emerging center of global governance. Its choice at the time was its geographical Asian neighbor, Australia, but it couldn't convince the other members of the club that Australia deserved a spot. It's different, of course, in the G20. 1986, Tokyo 2. We remember it for another forum of outreach. Until then, global financial governance had been held by the old G5. Yes, Japan was there, but Tokyo and Canada were not. But at Tokyo 1986, the club was expanded. So Canada and Italy got into that club. 1986 was also the summit that launched the Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations. The G7 had tried to do that the year before in Bonn. They failed, but in doing so, they almost destroyed the G7 summit. Japan got the job done. And of course, at the subsequent Japanese-hosted summit in 1993, Tokyo 3, that summit did the market access deal that broke the logjam that meant that the world at the GATT successfully concluded the Uruguay round. That might seem like distant history, but compare it with how things have been going with the launch and non-conclusion of today's Doha development round, started in 2001, but undone now. 2000, Okinawa. Japan gave birth to the Global Fund against HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria. It took a giant leap forward in bringing civil society in to G8 governance. And it tried, but failed, to invite some of its fellow Asian leaders to participate in what was now the G8 summit with Russia on board. China was one of those countries. Couldn't quite pull it off then. But it did manage to bring to Tokyo the heads of some of the world's major multilateral organizations, the head of the World Health Organization, of course, individuals who properly claim to represent the global community as a whole. 2008, Toyako Hokkaido. Japan secured a consensus from the G8 for a new approach to climate change control after it was pretty clear that the Kyoto formula wasn't going to do the job. It was a new sectoral bottom-up approach, which meant that all carbon-producing powers could and should control their carbon, not just a small group of 34, as the Kyoto Protocol had said. Moreover, on expansiveness and inclusion in global governance, Japan held as an integral part of the Toyako Hokkaido Summit for the climate change discussion, which were a centerpiece, not just a chat amongst the 8 or the 9 or the 10 with the European Union there, but 17 countries from a new major economies meeting and forum, including China, including many of the countries that we would recognize as the members of today's G20. But of course, Toyako Hokkaido was also the place where a small group of countries, the leaders of the BRICS, met by themselves on the sideline. So there is an alternative for some countries in the great global game of centers of global governance. One of the reasons I think why Japan and others would prefer both the G8 and the G20 because the BRICS is there now, but many of those countries are not there in that. Japan, of course, enjoyed many successes at other G8 summits. But in the broader G8 system, I think we should recall two defining facts. Japan from the start has been a member of all of the G7, G8 institutions. The latest edition, Russia. An earlier edition, the European Union, is not. So Japan is, if you will, the most permanent member of the entire G8 system. And on some of the new bodies, the Global Health Security Initiative, some of the older ones, the Trade Ministers, Quadrilateral, and of course the good old G7 Finance Ministers. There, when a global financial crisis hits, you can count on Japan and a small group of others to be there as the first responders in truly crisis-ridden times. What about the G20? The story of G20 governance is really framed by two great global financial crises. The one which still rings with great imminence in the minds of all Asians is the Asian-turned-global financial crisis that began in the summer of 1997 in Thailand and then went global over the next 2 years, consuming in turn, taking down Indonesia, Korea, Russia itself in August 1998. Then almost the United States with the death of long-term capital management. And then Brazil and in a year or two later, Argentina and Turkey as well. A global financial crisis, if one by today's standards, unfolded in slow motion. Nonetheless, it was enough to lead two particular individuals, Larry Summers of the United States, Paul Martin of Canada, to invent a new group to confront such crises should they recur, as they were almost certain to. It was understood. And to prevent them and contain them as best they could. Hence, the G20. If you look at the origins of the G20, of course, everybody assumed that Japan would be a member. But Japan didn't say, oh, we want to be the only Asian representative. Japan actually welcomed the emergence of the G20 because it was a much more Asian club than just the old G8. Look at the arithmetic. The G20, which only has 19 countries, actually has 5 Asian members: Japan, China, Korea, Indonesia, and Australia. That's about 25%. The G8 just had 1, if you say Russia is almost everything. So the G20 was a great leap forward for all of Asia, and that's the kind of global governance forum that Japan thought the world needed now. Japan, of course, on the difficult decisions about who would be a member, not everybody was in favor of bringing Saudi Arabia in. The G8, of course, is an all-democratic club. How would you cope if you had more diversity in the G20? China had to be there, yes, but Saudi Arabia. Japan, of course, as a matter of rational calculation, with some hint of inclusiveness, wanted Saudi Arabia in. An energy-dependent Japan, Saudi Arabia with a lot, but some sense that a new club could bring together that diversity, have a conversation across the diversity, socialize countries into a new multicultural world. An outward-looking Japan we can see signs of at the beginning back then. What have Japan's achievements been in G20 governance, particularly when it leapt to the leaders level, to the summit level back in 2008? Could have done it a few years earlier. Prescience, prevention in global governance. Paul Martin had the vision, as many here know. Wanted to hold the G20 at the leaders level and almost pulled it off in 2005. Prime Minister Koizumi was convinced in the end of the merits. Said, okay, I'll come to the first, and if it works, I'll go to the next one, and every one since. The only holdout amongst the 20 was the President of the United States, George W. Bush. But it was George Bush who, by the autumn of 2008, after Lehman and AIG and many other pillars of American capitalism died, knew he needed to respond not by himself, but with a global governance group of his friends. And once he thought about it, not just the good old G8, maybe with a few others added, but the tried and true and proven G20 itself. And of course, that was Japan's choice, as it was every other member of the established G20. So what has Japan done in it? The first, and we'll begin modestly, G20 summitry has given Japan much enhanced access to its special American ally, FaceTime with the president. Yes, at all of the G20 summits themselves, they started off having 2 a year in addition to the G8 ones. But at the many more finance ministers meetings that have been held, not just 1 a year anymore, but more, the preparatory meetings for these summits, but at other ministerial meetings too, finance, but now G20 governance has spread to agriculture ministers, labor, development, foreign affairs, and even a meeting of tourism ministers is about to arise. That's important for Japan, who, with its revolving door prime ministers, has found it increasingly difficult to get standalone bilateral FaceTime with the president to continue a tradition of old, the first meetings, right? And you can see why President of the United States tends to say, well, pretty busy. How much time should I invest in, developing a real relationship with the President of Japan who might not be there next year? So that kind of FaceTime with the President, access into the American administration, has been increasingly and importantly delivered by G20 governance. Secondly, Japan has been able to secure exemptions for its exceptional needs. One of the great highlights of G20 governance was the historic Toronto G20 summit in the summer of 2010. Not all of my fellow Torontonians remember it that way. But it had to confront the first installment of the great European crisis, Greece won. And to do it, it had to convince skitterish markets that all of the key countries would control their soaring deficits and accumulated government debts. So they all pledged, the advanced members of the group, that they would cut their deficits in half as a percentage of GDP by 2013, and by 2016 stop the rise in their accumulated government debt as a percentage of GDP. But from the start, they gave Japan an exemption because they simply knew it was in a special situation and, of course, couldn't do it. Not that they anticipated the shocks of 2011, but they knew enough to give Japan the breathing space that it needed then. Japan has also been able to join with others to veto bad ideas in G20 governance. There's a fairly long list, but one of the key examples is an early idea of the Europeans, supported in the end by the Americans, that we should slap a global levy on the big banks, presumably to punish them for their misdeeds in creating the financial crisis, or to raise more money, which all of the governments in the advanced countries were in desperately need of. Japan thought this was a very bad idea. So did Canada. So did every other member of the G20. If you'd had to decide that within the good old G7, just look at the numbers. All the Europeans and the United States up against the polite Japanese and the Canadians. I think the Canadian-Japanese position would probably have lost. But in the G20, every other member that wasn't a member of the G7 backed Canada, backed Japan, and the idea of a big bank levy died. And then in the little reprise we saw most recently at the French-hosted Cannes Summit in November, it took the form of a global international financial transaction task. And same numbers, same outcome. That idea had died as well. Why? It's not just about the banks, although a rich dialogue can be held there. But it points to, I think, an important point about the G20 and how it's different than the old G8. It is not just the same club of major powers with more numbers inside. To be a member of the G8, you have to be a major power and a democratic one, or at least a democratically committed one. And the Russian story still goes on. But to be a member of the G20 in a rational but prescient recognition of the new world, you have to be systemically significant. And you can be systemically significant as a country in two ways. The first one, Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, is you're so connected with the rest of the world that if you go down, you'll take everybody else with it. You're a consumer of financial security in the discourse of a distant age. Or you can be systemically significant by being a provider of financial security, riding to the rescue when other countries go down and threaten to take the whole system because of the connectivity along with them as well. Look at the two financial crises, think of the numbers. the consumers of financial security in the Asian-turned global financial crisis are, I think, all now the providers of financial security in the American or Atlantic-turned global financial crisis of 2008 to now. There's actually only a handful of countries that were not consumers of financial security, either in the first crisis or in the one we're still in, but providers of financial security both times. And Japan, of course, is one of those that showed that extraordinary resilience in global financial governance because of its real financial resources a decade ago and to this day. We also see Japan's success in reforming the International Monetary Fund, changing the rules of the game that were created in that very Eurocentric world of 1944. And this is hard politics, so this is the ultimate zero-sum game. Because every share of the real power on the IMF executive board, the quota of voice and vote, that I get, if I'm a rising power and deserve it, has to be given up by somebody else. So the declining powers that simply aren't as big as they were in 1945. For those of you who believe in the autonomous impact of international institutions, the IMF tried repeatedly to reform itself on voice and vote reform. It failed. The G7 tried to reform IMF voice and vote reform, most notably at the Halifax Summit in 1995. It failed. Then the G20 tried, and it succeeded. In the first stage at the ministerial level in 2005, but above all at the leaders level at the Seoul Summit in November 2001. So in one of the toughest nuts to crack in the whole institutional, indeed constitutional structure of global governance, the G20 came through, and Japan was actually always in the lead of doing that reform along with its fellow rising Asian states, because the formula had become so obsolete that Japan was actually one of the rising powers in this particular game. There is, of course, one outstanding footnote that is worthy of mention. The G20 also agreed that henceforth the executive head of the IMF and the World Bank would be chosen on the basis of global merit from the global pool of candidates, rather than simply on the basis of nationality, as defined in a dirty deal in the 1940s. That, I think, is one of the commitments that has not yet been complied with, but we'll watch how the process of selecting a new executive head for the World Bank unfolds. Japan is a provider of global public goods. Much can be said here, but let's go to the moment the crisis hits. Lehman goes down September 15th, 2008. Who's the first responder? Well, in this case, it was the G7. Their central bankers flooding the world with liquidity. But it was basically the big four central banks, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, and of course, the Bank of Japan. Yes, Canada and the Swiss and the Chinese came in a second tranche to contribute, but it was the big four. Liquidity solves your immediate problem, but then, as good Keynesians, you need real fiscal support. Japan was the first to offer $100 billion in the form of a loan, yes, but to the IMF. And at the end of the day, when all the pledges were counted, who bore the burden? Japan, $100 billion. The USA, $100 billion too. I didn't grow up in a world where the relative capability of the United States was the same as Japan. The Europeans, all of Team Europe, the largest marketplace in the world, they put in a $100 billion too. the Chinese 40 billion in the end. So you just do the raw arithmetic, who bore more than their fair share of the burden, and from the start through to the end, the answer is clearly Japan. We can look elsewhere at Japan's role in global governance to see how the very rules of the game are changing. And here, one of the things we look for is the contribution, not just in financial resources, but in institutional initiative. After the first Washington summit, Japan offered to host the second G20 summit, and then the third, but quickly understood that it was better for the global community if the second one was hosted by Gordon Brown's Britain, and the third one, which took place in Pittsburgh, was actually hosted by the new president of the United States, Barack Obama, right? Let's lock him into the game. After that, Japan had a choice. It could have bid to host the next one, but no. Its democratic neighbor from Asia wanted to do it. That was Korea. So Japan backed Korea, showing its expansive Asian solidarity, I think. So we haven't yet seen Japan host a G20 summit. It's not because they're not into the game. I think it's because of some pretty sophisticated foreign policy calculations on their part. Whenever one talks about symmetry, the question always arises when these politicians come together and make these promises. Then they go home. Do they keep the promises when they're back home alone? As David mentioned, we've spent a fair bit of time looking at precisely that. And I think the answer is pretty clear. In both the G8 and the G20, promises kept are, on the whole, promises made. Japan keeps its promises in the G8 close to the average, but a little less than the other members do. But in the G20, Japan's compliance record is significantly above the average for the G20. Further evidence, I think, that Japan is actually bearing more than its fair share of the burden, not only in making paper promises, but in actually making the change back at home to get the collective commitments put into effect in the real world. Let me end by looking most broadly at global governance from my de facto starting point in 1944, 1945 to now. I think we can see that there have been three great leaps forward in global governance since the first time. The first came beyond Bretton Woods a year later in the United Nations in 1945. And while we all love the United Nations, all Canadians in Japan, as I think scholars of global governance, the following can be accurately said. In the UN in 1945, an American-occupied Japan had no role in shaping the global governance of the charter that arose. After all, it was a defeated, devastated victim of the world's first use of nuclear weapons. It was in the charter then and now labeled, it's pretty clear, an enemy, alien, aggressor state. In a charter that prohibited international interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states. A charter that did not even recognize the existence of the natural environment, let alone its value. A charter that excluded Japan from the Security Council Permanent Five, where the only representative from Asia was China, but where all the members quickly became nuclear weapons states. In part, I think, have remained nuclear weapons states in order to support their status within the P5. Japan, long the second, now the third most powerful country in the world, ruthlessly anti-nuclear weapons state, frozen out of that center of global security government. And in Japan, that has been an environmental pioneer in global governance, also not in at the UN's global governance core. Flash forward to 1975, to the birth of the G7. Japan was a fully equal founding member. It was the only Asian member of a group that contained, as equal members, 4 non-nuclear countries and only 3 nuclear weapons wands. What kind of balance do you want for global security governance? The UNSCP5 or the G7 one? A G7 that in that informal charter, the first communique, identified environmental values, conservation, just one word, but at least it was there, that dedicated itself to, as I mentioned, spread of open democracy, individual liberty, by implicitly, but in reality interfering in the internal affairs of sovereign states. The RP2 institution before the world had invented the phrase. Japan, of course, that in the G8 helped it stop the oil shocks, invent climate change governance, that actually secured G7 recognition at one summit for a just resolution of the Northern Territories problem that Japan had with its neighbor Russia. And perhaps most recently, in the days following Fukushima, when we saw not the magic of the marketplace, but the mania of the marketplace, with the yen soaring to historic highs, further damaging Japan's export-dependent economy. It was the G7 that was there within days, with the first coordinated exchange rate intervention in a decade in order to bring the value of the Japanese yen down. Finally then, the G20 at 1999. Japan is a full, enthusiastic founding member in a club that finally contained more Asian members than European ones. Japan still scarred from the haunting memories of the Asian financial crisis, eager to make the G20 work to bring, if you remember its core mission, financial stability to the world, but also, thanks to Paul Martin, making globalization work for the benefit of all. A G20 that delivered the IMF voice and vote reform that gives Japan and other emerging and Asian powers the voice they deserve. And then, of course, stopped the great plunge into the world's worst recession since the 1930s. And as, of course, the leaders of the G20 were in free fall. They thought not just of the Great Depression, but they thought of what it would bring and what it could bring again. Hitler and the Holocaust were on the minds of many with long memories of that dark age. So with such a record of achievement, I think we can understand why Japan has chosen both the good old G8 and the new G20. We can also, I think, see how Japan's colleagues in the G20 and Japan itself, who would know and understand of its repeated leadership in G8 and G20 governance, would see it as a way in which Japan can still shape, despite the current time of troubles, the kind of world order that it and its closest partners prefer. So with that, let me turn it over to see what the conversation will yield.
Thank you very much, John, for that, to mix metaphors, that grand tour de force. Really appreciate it. And we are open for questions from both the audience here and the audience on the web. And I'll begin with a question from the web, relayed to me by the miracle of the modern BlackBerry. With its declining population and the rise of China, what can Japan do to remain a crucial cog in the wheel of global governance?
Well, when we look at the two G groups, of course, we think of the member of the good old G7, G8 with the smallest population from the start. That's Canada. And if Canada can maintain its status as a full member for reasons other than the politeness of its colleagues, but a hard contribution, and use it to shape global governance too. Japan, whose population I think will shrink from about 127 million now to an estimated 90 million or so a few decades hence. That's no reason to think that a country that's still 3 times as populous as Canada, still larger than any of the European ones of the day who are also downsizing, that could well actually be larger in population than the Russian Federation, right? And that in a broader G20, as you look out a few decades, we'll see a shrinking China, and in India a few decades. So we're all aging, right? So in the raw numbers, it's not a problem. And Japan may in fact have first mover advantage. Aging of the population was an issue that actually came onto the G20 agenda at the finance ministers level in one of the first ministerial meetings hosted in Asia, brought to you by the Australians of all people. Australia, of course, has actually a rising population and a non-aging one, so you just have to assume that they were looking outwards to the issues or problems of their neighbors next door. So in macro terms, not problem. In more specialized terms, one can point to a few things. One is the strong emphasis on human capital and modern education and indeed internet connectivity as the drivers of our real economic growth in the future. And there are many ways in which Japan can claim leadership in segments of those, although we all tend to think of the obstacles it faces. There are others. In here, I must say, let me highlight one where both of the G groups have struggled and largely failed. In 2 words, it's gender equality. The G8 has actually made some small progress of late, particularly in the G8 Africa Action Plan, because of at least one of the members of the G8 making sure that gender equality value and its implications were there. It was not something that the Africans themselves asked for. It'll be a tougher haul in the G20, which is why it's not really there now. If you do have Saudi Arabia as a member, right, and perhaps some other countries with large Islamic populations or other faith groups, it's tough to get a consensus of how to move forward on that. But despite those obstacles, I think on the whole, we can see with the great intensity of G20 governance, certainly the institutional forums where new ideas, innovative growth, green growth can get on the table, some of those areas in which Japan has been a pioneer.
On balance, has Japan's constitutional and domestic political limitations on its international security role been an asset or a liability?
It's a big judgment. If you think that the future of global security governance in the 21st century is one that will be given or guaranteed by the classic formula many of my age grew up with, nuclear weapons, which deter the use of nuclear weapons by other Westphalian sovereign states, then you can have a rich debate. But if you think the world has changed, to quote the Wizard of Oz, I don't think we're living in Westphalia of 1648 anymore. It's a world not of static sovereigns playing the old game. It's increasingly a world of intense interconnectivity that the G20 recognizes, right? That's the whole point about systemic significance. You go down today, I don't say, aha, I'm ahead in the old relative capability game. I go down tomorrow. It's a complex, adaptive system. That's what we have to govern. In climate change, we know. In the internet, cyberspace on the positive side, cyber espionage on the weak. Global health governance. SARS in Hong Kong one day, Japan the next, Toronto two. So in the field of nuclear weapons, I think there is a growing understanding, a revealed prevalence, that the fewer countries that have the bomb or can get it, if only because they might fall into the hands of non-state actors. If Iran gets it, who will get it a year from now? Or the horrible problems, which we haven't quite yet had in the full shock scenario and tend to overlook, inadvertent, accidental, and unauthorized launch. That's the nuclear problem of the 21st century. And the only way to contain it is to stop it at source. And there, I think the numbers, the balance, are right in the G20, far more than even in the G8, now with Russia in, right? You have an overwhelmingly non-nuclear weapons majority in the G20. But it is a problem as follows, and involves an important question that many scholars of G20 governance and practitioners agonize with all the time. At the Pittsburgh Summit in 2009, September, the G20 leaders proudly proclaimed that henceforth they would be the permanent premier forum for our members' international economic cooperation. There was much that was good for Japan in that, but the division of labor seemed to be the old G8 would do, as I alluded to, security, Iran's nukes, and development, and then the G20 would do finance and economics. But it was always a fiction, and was in fact silly, because anybody who's done summitry know that the one person in the government of Canada or Japan that we pay to worry about all the problems all the time together and try and find win-win-win solutions, that's the leader. So when you get leaders together at a summit, nobody's going to tell them you can't talk about this or that because of this so-called division of labor. There's a particular incident which was revealing in two ways. The first is a matter of process. The Americans had a terrific idea. They were very committed to it. At the Pittsburgh Summit, at Toronto, and since. Every other member, including Japan, thought it was a bad idea, so it didn't happen. But substantively, well, in terms of process, this proves that the G20 is not an American-dominated or directed or led club, despite the fact that the American president hosted the first summit and the third. But in terms of substance, I think the Americans were right and everyone else was wrong. The specific issue was this. It had been declared by the Financial Action Task Force that Iran actually was engaged in money laundering and tax evasion and tax abuse as a non-compliant country. And Leo Brainerd, the finance deputy of the United States, said, we should all say in the communique, there is this empirical finding, and name names. Iran, you are guilty, and that would be the justification for imposing more sanctions on a G20-wide basis, with China and India in as well. But but everybody else said, oh no, that looks like political security, and we only do finance and economics. Of course, everyone knew that what the Americans had on their minds was sanctioning Iran to stop its nuclear weapons program, right? But if you go back to G20 governance a long time ago, from this starting point, the third G20 ministerial meeting was supposed to take place in India, didn't, took place in Ottawa, took place in the autumn of 2011. It's an important moment because in the immediate wake of 9/11, March 11, no other international institution, old or new, could physically function. Not the IMF, not the G7. The only one that did, thanks to Paul Martin, was the G20. And because there was a G20 meeting in Ottawa, other meetings were held as part of that. But talk about fast-moving, flexible, what the G20 did had been created only 2 years ago, to no more Asian financial crises. But it shifted like a laser beam to a deal with terrorist finance. And of course, imagine the 20 finance ministers around the table. Well, Gordon Brown, what do you know about Islamic finance and hawalas? And, well, not much. Paul, what do you know? Well, American Treasury Secretary, but the people who had the expertise were the people at the lower end of the batting order, if you will, Indonesia, Turkey, and yes, Saudi Arabia too. So they were all there together in a process of learning about how to govern a completely unforeseen event in what was really a complex adaptive system, where the little ones were the teachers, but they all came together in an extraordinary interpersonal bond. If you could do that at the finance minister's level in that searing moment of a crisis, why couldn't you just, with that memory, do it a little bit more preventatively at the leaders' level and say, yes, Lyle, we get it, right? So maybe we should move a little before Iran or its closest friends in Lebanon or who knows where might move closer to getting the bombs. So that raises the big question of how do you think the G20 might evolve? And I'm on the optimistic side of this glass is half full. When leaders get together, they will be leaders if they're allowed to. And leaders can do anything and should do it in those win-win, interlinked, creative, and ideally proactive and preventative ways. So I think that story is still waiting to roll out. We'll have to see. But some of the dynamics, I think, from the past, from that 9/11 moment, really do show not just what the G20 could be, but what it actually has been in the past. Would that the G20 had been impressive as a center of global governance, fast, flexible, fast-moving, integrative, in the wake of March 11th, 2011, as it was in 9/11 here in North America, if I might put it that way. But that's an issue we can take up tomorrow.
I'll take a question from the floor here.
Thank you. Professor Kirton, about Japan's leadership in the G8 and G20, have you observed a difference in Japan's leadership in these institutions since the change in government, since the DPJ took over, so September 2009-ish? Has Japan's leadership in these institutions changed much since then? I know that's a fairly small period. And also, if you could comment on what do you think the domestic challenges Japan faces as a result of 3/11 going forward? What impact will those domestic challenges have on Japan's capacity and willingness to lead in the G8 and the G20? Thanks.
On the first question, and it's an important one, on the whole, I do think one of the causes of high performance in G20 governance is the the continuity and the competence and the commitment of the actual leaders at the table. So Paul Martin is finance minister, Paul Martin is prime minister in the great quest to bring a summit to life. And boy, whatever you think about partisan politics in Britain, we were awfully lucky to have Gordon Brown, a veteran, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, but there as a leader, right, when the latest big crisis hit. Look at the Japanese Prime Minister. You have, of late, very little continuity. Indeed, when Koizumi-san went to his first G8 summit, he came back and told his Sherpa, I felt as if I was naked, like a little child. It really does take some time to not just, learn the personalities, the players. And of course, Japan has always had a bit of a linguistic barrier, right? You just can't crack jokes the way Silvio Berlusconi and George W. Bush could, for example. The competence also matters. When Paul Martin was there, not only had he been finance minister for a very long time, but he'd been the CEO of a company of some global involvement. So he didn't need, when his bureaucrats suggested, I'm paraphrasing or extrapolating, all the brilliant PhDs in economics from the University of Chicago who now work at IMF say you have to do this. Paul said, well, actually, no. I know enough to know, no, I don't have to, right? And that won't, both from the private sector side and from the finance minister side. You can extend that out. Our dear G20 leaders are trying to regulate things as detailed as executive pay. What's a senior executive VP of the Bank of Nova Scotia going to get this year, right? Can you imagine? I mean, the King of Saudi Arabia having a voice on that. Or accounting standards, self-governing, professional, regulatory bodies. Why would you want, Barack Obama, yes, a lawyer, but to tell you what accounting standards you should use? Or the other way around. If part of the problem is accounting standards for Islamic finance back to 9/11, right? Why would you think that Stephen Harper, even though he came from a family where there were accountants, right, would know anything about that? So the expertise actually, this is the competence, does matter. So yes, earlier Japanese leaders, primarily in G8, they had the continuity advantage, Koizumi-san, right? But there's more packed into to that, which is why I think, just to extend the point, why the intensification institutionally of G20 governance, where you give more ministers from different portfolios a place. I mean, that's one of the guarantees that you're not going to hit the ground cold, right? If you have rotating prime ministers, if I could put it that way. It's a problem we've long dealt with in Italy before Mr. Berlusconi arrived, recognizing the ironies in the way I put it just then. Sorry, the second part of your question was?
It related to the impact of the 311 domestic challenges on Japan's future willingness and capacity to lead at the G8 and G20.
I think it is still understandably self-absorbed in dealing with the aftermath. And of course, with this added burden of political uncertainty, it's very difficult for the Prime Minister of Japan to even plausibly promise to launch and then follow up on a diplomatic initiative over the next 3 or 6 months. So that has meant that we haven't seen anything real yet. What I can say is that there's a landing spot, Camp David, the next G8 summit, designed to be one of the best, leaders alone, small, intimate, face-to-face, tough talk, the kind of conversations you have with your spouse. I mean, it really is pretty hard. On the agenda, in a big way, is energy security. And as part of the energy security problematique is nuclear energy. So there's an idea. I don't know if Barack Obama has said, who do you want to lead the discussion on nuclear energy amongst the G8? You do have a choice. You could ask Angela Merkel, who would give a wonderfully convincing, and she's got a lot of authority on the G8, about why we should all get rid of our nuclear power plants, just like Germany is doing now, right? Or you could ask President of France, right? No, let's just keep building ever more. Things are fine, right? But if you really want somebody who will identify the balance, right, the trade-offs, the risks, who better than the Prime Minister of Japan? So that's one opportunity. The second opportunity is the G20 Las Cabas Summit coming up in June on Mexico's Pacific coast. At the moment, this category of natural disasters is really not on the agenda. Interesting, it was at G20 summits in the recent past, the Haitian earthquake, January 12th, 2010, put it there. Fortuitously, the G20 Sherpas were actually meeting in Mexico City on that day. They heard of the earthquake. They rushed to issue a statement in the name of the full G20, expressing condolences, but also saying we'll be there for you on relief and reconstruction. One of the Sherpas did think, well, didn't we just decide at Pittsburgh? We just do finance and economics, and this looks pretty political in a human security or whatever humanitarian kind of way, but that like technical distinction, right, was washed away by the common humanitarian bounding and bonding. Mexico City is not very far from Haiti in a number of ways. The G20 didn't come through for Japan on March 11 in a similar way, but nonetheless, there's an opportunity to recall that very recent G20 history, those bonds of solidarity, and get the G20 to work for today's Japan as well. What global governance institution can govern, remember the triple disaster, both natural disasters, earthquakes and tsunamis, plus nuclear disasters, safety, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Toikumura, right, and now Fukushima, plus the known immediate financial and economic downsides of the triple part of the triple header that these things bring. Well, if the G20 was designed to do finance and economics, right, why wouldn't you start there and then govern in ways that deal with what are now the precursors, right? But the economic and finance problem, as I started with, still remains. So 20 people, there's always the opportunity for them to get it right. But we always have to remember that Calderon is a lame duck host on his way out. So it'll take some ingenuity, I think, to get the governors to do what could be done there.
Time for perhaps 2 more questions, one more from the web. If the United States does indeed pivot to an Asia-Pacific defense priority, will Japan's strategic position in the world be enhanced?
Pivot. Well, first question is, what are they going to pivot? And with long memories of Asian security, going back, let's say to December 1941, what do they pivot? Attack aircraft carrier squadrons. Well, how useful have they been in the various security problems we still confront? One of the big issues for the G8 is what do we do in Afghanistan for the transformational decade that lies ahead. And all the American attack aircraft carrier squadrons in the world actually were not of much use in having us not lose so far and that war and winning the peace. They could have been very useful in Libya, right? But on the whole, they were very little used. Great for disaster relief, right? The Asian tsunami. So you think of the critical capabilities there. But if you go to, and I'm an old line realist, Hans Morgenthau, the ultimate factor of national power is the quality of diplomacy. Right? So I hope they pivot the diplomacy and the best diplomats they've got. And problem number one for me, yes, I know, territory matters. It did in Westphalia too. But it's the North Korean nuclear program, or the human security disaster of the famine, or anything that can roll out from whatever combination of the two. To get that one right, you need the combined talents of all the frontline states. And here I don't think, we might begin with the United States because we're here in North America, but the frontline states are pretty clear. It's Japan, it's Korea, it's China, and perhaps Russia too. So what global governance clubs would you need to provide maybe second level support for what they might come to consensus on together, have dialogues about? They're all in the G20, and that's a good thing. But if, North Korean problems like the nuclear program or the Chinam, if they're too rich for the great division of labor, why can't the G20 start with food security? That's big on the agenda at Los Cabos and at Camp David. Food security means ultimately people shouldn't starve, right? So why don't we start there and work it out from there, again, as a toehold, right, to try and add value. So in my world, those would be the kind of questions I'm asking more broadly outside of global governance. I lived in a world where you had to ask the hardcore questions. If I guess these would be the June 25th, 1950 questions, the day the Korean War began. If the balloon goes up and the sirens start to wail, who is going to fight on whose side? And by my quick count, if it's China that needs an ally, who can they count on? Maybe North Korea. If North Korea needs an ally, who can they count on? Conceivably China, but nobody else. But who can Japan count on? Or the Republic of Korea? Everybody else, including, I would say, Canada as well as. So in terms of the basic balance of power, right, to the extent that the North Korean regime is a tall, irrational calculator, and to the extent is important, I don't feel particularly insecure about Asian security, and I hope that the Americans would not abandon in their diplomatic and physical assets those which they might usefully have proximately to, let's say, the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, or even closer to Syria, right? Because it is still a great power, which are global powers, and they have to worry about all of the world all the time and have the forces and the diplomats to be able to solve the worst problems that could arise there. So go slow, United States. Largely, the Asians or the Asians with their Pacific friends, right, largely can probably take care of the more likely big security problems that could arise over there.
Time for one last question from the floor.
Hi, Keith Heipel from CIGI and University of Waterloo. Thank you for an excellent presentation. You very nicely stated how Japan has shown excellent international leadership. Something that gives a country a lot of credibility is how well it treats its own citizens. How fair is a country to its own citizens? Let's say within the G20, how does Japan compare in terms of, let's say, wealth distribution, narrowing the gap between the rich and poor, to give it a lot of credibility?
Less well than it used to. When I started going to Japan, it was an exemplar both in what you saw in the streets and in the OECD statistics of income equality relative to other countries in the G7 or beyond. But as I think many people know, Japan too, like Canada, like the United States, has moved in the direction of income inequality, and there's enough candidates generically to explain why that's happening to pretty much all of us. So the question is, well, I don't think that is Japan's biggest soft power advantage at the moment. But it's still got something to say for itself. To the extent that relative income equality, together with social security, and by that I mean not just check arrives from Ottawa with a maple leaf on it, but your neighbor, all right? The integrity of social cohesion. Japan is an overwhelmingly safe place. And if you just step back and look at some of the big aggregates of national power, hardcore national interests, if I could just take us there for a moment. How much civil strife is there in each of the countries of the G8 or G20? I grew up in a world in which, in the case of the United States, there was a great deal. Black Day in July, I guess we Canadians would call it. Now there's almost none. So in some ways, on that core measure, the United States is actually much stronger on the social cohesion, right, than it was in the 60s and the 70s, and that feeds into the American decline rate. But Japan is still pretty much as almost perfect as it's been for decades. Yes, there is the more silent stuff, suicides in the schools. It comes at a cost. Or a bigger question, well, let's compare it to its next door neighbor, China, right? Now number 2. Civil strife is a daily occurrence. It's endemic all through the PRC in ways that really worry the leadership. So that is a big Chinese vulnerability in a category of consequence in which Japan has none. Another question, if you're a sovereign state, back to Westphalia, the central government should have a single rule of law on all of the territorial domain. That's true in Japan, has been for a very long time. It's not true in India. It's not true in China, right? And Russia is, depending on what's going on in Chechnya in the southern. So on those basic political sources of capability or vulnerability, I see extraordinary continuing Japanese hardcore fundamental strength, which you can see feeding through to, the intervening variables in the jargon of my trade, income inequality, but the sense of social cohesion, the solidarity. And if you needed to stress test that, right? March 11th, right? How did the Japanese people react even when, let's say, their governors didn't react as optimally as they could? And I think the Japanese people get very high marks. So beyond the inequality, I think there's an extraordinary story to be told about the collective resilience and adaptability in the face of the unprecedented of the Japanese people. And I suspect that will be a source of soft power strength. You can do it comparatively. And of course, there's always in danger of being politically incorrect. But we think of Haiti. It didn't have the triple header. It just had a natural disaster. And how is that community coming through, right? Or others. So once again, I think David spoke of the resourcefulness of the Japanese people in Japan. I think the more technical concept I would use is the resilience, and still see enormous strength that will probably have reputational advantages going forward. You can look at the world surveys of public opinion. In Japan, still is right up there, number 1 or 2 amongst all in the world, as having the number 1 net positive image as a country you'd like. So they may be a little less poor, but a lot of the soft power strengths are still there and have had March 11th reinforcements which fit in to a broader picture of Japan.
Well, John, judging from the questions remaining just from the web audience, let alone from here in the room, we could keep you up all night. What the web audience doesn't know is that the rest of us have had dinner while you've been talking, and so we should give you an opportunity to enjoy dinner. But let me thank you on behalf of all of us here, actually and virtually, for really a stunning tour. And the optimistic note is very much appreciated at this anniversary of a very, very dark time. So thank you very much once again. And thanks to the audience here and remotely. I would like to note that the Japan Futures Initiative is entirely dependent on the goodwill and support of other partners and organizations. And tonight, we're fortunate to have a number of supporters that have made this possible. First and foremost, the Japan Foundation, through a very generous grant, has made this event possible in the first place. The Center for International Governance Innovation, who is bringing us this webcast and supported us in various other ways as well. Wellesley School of International Affairs, providing the venue and the conference logistical support. The East Asian Studies program at Renison University College, University of Waterloo. And last but not least, the Shibusawa Eiichi Memorial Foundation, which is responsible for my personal interest in Japan dating back now 25 years. So to all of the partners and co-sponsors, thank you very much, and to the audience, thank you as well. Hope you will join us again on another future CIGI Signature Lecture Series event. Hello and welcome to tonight's CIGI Signature Lecture and the keynote address for the 2012 Japan Futures Initiative Spring Symposium, the inaugural symposium of the Japan Futures Initiative. I'm David Welch, the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Wellesley School of International Affairs, and it's my pleasure to be your host tonight. To our audience in the room, welcome. Some of you have come from a very, very long way away to be with us today and tomorrow. And to our web audience, welcome as well. Some of you are also a very long way away. The Japan Futures Initiative is a new enterprise based here at the University of Waterloo, but not solely at the University of Waterloo, the purpose of which is to help re-energize the policy-relevant social scientific study of Japan. As those of us who follow trends in international studies have noticed, interest in Japan as a subject of serious social scientific research has declined quite dramatically over the past 10 years or so, primarily as a result of the experience of Japan having been in decline itself from the heady days of the economic bubble in the 1980s and 1990s. And as a result of China's rise and Korea's skillful entrepreneurship in the cultivation of interest in the research about Korea overseas, a lot of resources have been steered towards the study of China and Korea in the last decade and away from Japan. While this might be understandable in a simple psychological sense, it's my view and the view of my colleagues who've been engaged in the process of cultivating the Japan Futures Initiative that this is a serious mistake for a couple of reasons. The first and most important of which is that there is no better or more important time for those of us in OECD countries to be studying Japan, because Japan is at the forefront of all of the challenges that Canada, the United States, most European countries, Australia, New Zealand are all going to be facing very shortly. Declining population, steady state or declining economic growth, aging population, energy shortages. Japan is the country that is going to confront these things first about it than any other human alive. John is going to speak tonight to us about Japan's contribution to global governance. And when we advertised this keynote lecture, that was the title I understood that he wanted to use. A little bit later, he came back to me and said, I'd prefer to talk about Japan's leadership in global governance. And I said, by all means, please do that. leadership is certainly a form of contribution. So please join me in welcoming Professor John Kirton to the podium. And for those of you who are watching via webcast, we will ask you please to think about questions and indicate via the chat function on the webcast. Questions you might have for Professor Kirton. He would be more than happy to answer them when he is given his presentation, and we look forward to that opportunity. John.
Thank you very much, David. Arigatou gozaimasu for those kind words, for your important role in bringing together and inaugurating this important event. But I think more broadly, for those of us of a particular generation who have long been studying Japan, for taking the leadership in the initiative to really unleash a new generation of scholarly thinking on Japan and its role in the world, both in Canada, but with so many distinguished colleagues from Japan itself. Thank you also for the sponsors of this event, and if I single out one on a personal note, I'm sure you'll forgive me, David DeWitt, a career-long colleague. So thank you for your support, David, and for flying back from Washington to identify and correct any errors I may make, as you've been doing as a good colleague for the past several decades, I might reveal. It's a great honor, especially in the company of such distinguished authorities, to launch our look at Japan. Japan during its time of troubles right now, but Japan in a global context and how the two come together at the moment and as we look forward to the future of Japan in the world. I think it's important to start with the time of troubles because at first glance, over the past year and indeed for the 2 decades before, Japan has had a truly tough end, perversely. But behind that lies an undervaluated Chinese yuan next door, tied to a dropping US dollar as well. A big hit for the export-dependent economy that Japan has long had. Japan's trade deficit has just reappeared after an absence of 31 years, largely because of the impact of Fukushima. Before Fukushima, Japan relied on nuclear energy for about 29% of its electricity. It was going to go to 50% by 2030 for all the good reasons. But now with most of the reactors offline, it's had to massively import fossil fuel from abroad. And in fact, its utilities demand for oil imports have increased by a factor of 4 just over the last year, with of course implications for energy prices for Americans filling up at the pump and many other people in the world. Japan's population size, we know, is shrinking. Fewer Japanese citizens to bear the financial burden. Its population is aging very quickly, already number 1 in the OECD, but quite predictably, as the population ages, they turn from that phenomenal savings rate, 16%, which Japan produced about 20 years ago, which would finance within Japan those great government deficits and debt. It's now dropped to about 2%, forcing Japan, looking forward, depend on international markets to cover the deficits and debt. Politically, of course, we've had revolving door prime ministers. Average tenure in office about 1 year, no more. Very different days from those of Nakasone-san and Koizumi-san, and one wonders when it will end, or even if there's more to come. Perhaps both of the old line parties, many fear, will soon be blown away by a new regionally based party out of Osaka with new but still untested ideas on a national scale. Last year, of course, China surpassed Japan as the #2 most powerful country in the world by the...
Japan is a country of great resourcefulness, amazing human capital, a great deal of financial capital, notwithstanding the sovereign debt situation, a great deal of ingenuity. Japan has a history of overcoming serious challenge, overcoming serious devastation, not only from World War II, but as we've seen most recently, almost a year ago, from the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami of March 11, 2011. Japan is a country that knows how to deal with challenges, and Japan is dealing with the challenges that we here in Canada and elsewhere will be dealing with very shortly. So this is a particularly good time for us to be paying more, not less, attention to Japan. So the Japan Futures Initiative is a network of scholars and practitioners, open to anyone, anywhere, largely at the moment, because we're new, here in Canada and in Japan. The purpose of which is to help synergize collective study of Japan from a policy-relevant social scientific perspective. And today is the beginning of our first, what we hope will be an annual symposium, to look at various challenges that Japan is facing and to see how we, as a larger community, might learn from them. The topic of this year's symposium is disaster management, energy security, and multilateral cooperation, the Tohoku disaster and its regional and global implications. And that will be the focused study of the symposium all day tomorrow. But to begin us tonight, we have a somewhat more uplifting theme. We're very pleased to welcome as our keynote speaker, Professor John Kirton from the University of Toronto, who's the director of the G8 Research Group and the co-director of the G20 Research Group at the Munk School for Global Affairs, and a prolific author, and I think I'm on safe ground saying recognized worldwide as the world's first authority on the G8, G20, and global governance related to those forms of symmetry. The G8 Research Group, for those who do not know, is the de facto secretariat of the G8. G8 Research Group tracks the commitments of G8 countries year after year, monitors their compliance to the commitments, and acts as a repository of information about any and all aspects of G8 symmetry. And Professor Kirton has been quarterbacking this effort now for many, many years and knows more.
Time, which I know many are all too familiar with, but it's important, I think, to identify specifically the many challenges that seem to confront Japan and its friends at this time. The first, of course, the great disaster of March 13th last year. Not just a natural disaster, we've had those before, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. Not just a nuclear disaster, as those other two were, but it was as if Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island had been combined with the Great Asian Tsunami and then produced a major economic disaster for Japan as well. So it was a triple disaster all in one time, in one place. And I think that's an unprecedented shock and an unprecedented challenge for global governance as a whole. The shocks, of course, hit Japan, whose GDP had contracted last year, contracted last quarter, and is still even below its peak economic performance before Lehman went down on September 15th of 2008. It also compounded the problem of Japan's soaring fiscal deficit, 7.6% of GDP this year, But within that, what the triple disaster brought was a newly severe structural deficit as the atomic power stations went offline, as supply chains were disrupted, and as massive new monies were required for immediate disaster relief, and then for the reconstruction effort that goes on now. Japan's public debt, compounded by this spending, already it's number one in the world at 236% of GDP. And that at a time, of course, when, because of the euro crisis, markets and many others are sensitive to the aggregate debt burdens that a country bears. Not surprisingly, one of the rating agencies in Japan last December downgraded Japan's score, wondering if Japan could continue to service the debt as well as it had for many long years. Japan's export-dependent economy, hurt by a soaring yen,